the plan for today, let me see if we can get this working, is basically to give you a little bit of an update on the Language Flagship Technology Innovation Center projects, talk a little bit about survey highlights, and that's why JD is joining us today. We're also going to talk a little bit about events that we're planning for the Flagship annual meeting in Wisconsin. And finally, we're going to open up the forum for comments or questions that you may have. As Jim mentioned before, one way to participate is to put your comments or questions in the chat, and we will be sure to address those at the end of the webinar. So starting out with projects, as you know, a lot of the work that the center has done in the first year of operation has focused on strategic planning. And there is three components that I would like to mention today and that we would like to explain a little bit. One of them was a survey that was carried out throughout the Flagship programs. And JD is going to give you a little bit more information about that in a minute. Another piece in the strategic planning is a new media consortium brief. And I'm also going to explain a little bit more about that. For those of you who are not familiar with the new media consortium, it's one of the big players in educational technology at the level, for example, of EDUCAUSE. And then finally, part of the strategic planning is also a series of symposia that we planned. And as you know, we have the first one in November in Honolulu, and there is two more planned coming up soon this year. And finally, we're going to briefly tell you a little bit about a simulation prototype that we're building in the center as one of the functions of the center as an incubator for ideas. But before we move on, I would like to give the floor to JD so that he can give you a very brief update on the main highlights of the survey.
Thank you, Julio. Okay, I'm here to talk about the stakeholder views of the place of technology in the Flagship program survey that Jonathan Trace and Julio and I worked on over the last 6 months or so. Basically, the purpose of the survey was to gather information from different stakeholders within the Language Flagship programs regarding their technology use, professional development, collaboration, and the development of technology-based tools, technology for use in the capstone year, promoting language maintenance for graduating learners, and finally, adaptive technologies. As a way of framing the report of these results, we posed 3 research questions. The first was, what are the types and common uses of technology that the Language Flagship directors, instructors, and students are familiar with for the second language learning purposes that they need? And in what ways is technology used for training and professional development purposes in the Language Flagship? Finally, in what ways might technology be used to enhance second language learning and teaching in the future in the Language Flagship? In the process, we surveyed Language Center directors, Flagship directors, and Flagship instructors. You can see that we only had 4 responses from the Language Center directors, and 3 of those were current directors and 1 was former. So we essentially, feeling that that sample size was too small, decided to focus on the Language Flagship directors with 14 responses, Flagship instructors with 34 responses, and then the Flagship students with 100 responses. You can see that we have complete descriptions of each of those groups of people, the participants in these surveys, but I'm certainly not going to dwell on that right now. The materials that we used included 4 questionnaires, 3 of which are the focus of this report, for the Language Center directors, Flagship directors, Flagship instructors, and then the students. Each contains sections for technology-based teaching and learning tools, open-ended questions related to the challenges and availability of using technology, and then, of course, demographic questionnaires. Each questionnaire also contained unique sections aimed at the specific populations involved in the questionnaire, as described here, yeah? Basically, John Trace and I, who have experience with language surveys in particular, designed the survey, but with a great deal of help. We did brainstorming with the Language Center staff and the Flagship director, and we designed this questionnaires based on their ideas, and then later we revised the questionnaire based on their feedback. The questionnaires were administered online using Google Forms, and they were sent to 23 Language Center directors and 72 Flagship directors. We also sent out Flagship instructors and third and fourth year Flagship students surveys via the Flagship directors. We included an email cover letter, and we got IRB approval, our Human Subjects Committee approval before we moved forward. The results are quantitative and qualitative, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on these, but you can see that we present the results in terms of the questions, which are labeled down the left-hand side, then a brief description of each question, the number of people who answered. In the case of Flagship directors, that was 14. The mean for question number 10 at the top, that was 2.93 out of what? Out of 3. Yeah, that's very high. And then the standard deviation in this case was 0.26. We also show the percentage of people who responded with never, sometimes, and often. For question 10, that would be nobody responded with never. Sometimes was 7.10, and often was 92.90, which explains why the mean is so high. So we're interpreting the results in terms of means and standard deviations, but also in terms of the percentage of responses in each category to make it more revealing. Yeah. You can see that we asked the Flagship directors in Table 1 about the technology tools that are used in the classes. We also asked them about their interactions with other organizations, government programs, other Flagship programs, language centers, and private programs. In these PowerPoint slides, they're arranged from the highest mean to the lowest mean so that you can see that general websites, online resources, course manager, language websites, vocabulary tools, and audio-video conferencing, as well as media editing tools, had the highest means, and that the lowest means were for mobile apps, language exchange, role-play games, and so forth for the Flagship directors. Yeah. Of course, the report has much more detail on all of the questions that we covered, but you can see how we reported the results. We also have results, similar results then for the Flagship instructors, where the N size is, the number of people is 34 for question number 1. The mean is 2.68, the standard deviation 0.53, and then you see the percentages of folks who selected each option. Again, arranged from high to low. And then for the students, we have similar results posted table after table after table, actually, because there's a good deal of detail in the report. Yeah. We also have responses from them, from the students, about learning outside of the classroom, which is particularly interesting in this report. You can see that, in fact, we have 100 students responding, and that we're getting quite a bit of information about general websites, vocabulary tools, online resources, and so forth. And in fact, the comparison of the two groups of people is interesting in the report. The students really are comparable to the instructors and the directors. So we can look at many of the questions which were in common and see that directors and instructors are fairly similar in their responses and in their needs for technology, and the students are quite different, actually, in many ways. We also have qualitative analyses, then a lot of results there, but the main findings from the open-ended qualitative responses with regard to technology use were that there was a lot of variation in the responses across both topics and participant groups, and we discussed that in more detail. There was also indication that people are using very different technologies to accomplish similar things, and then there's also a lot of information about that we could use to create an inventory of the kinds of technology being used by the different programs and the different groups. So in the report, in one of the appendices, there's actually an Excel spreadsheet that you can click on and look at. If you open the Word version of the report, you can click on the Excel spreadsheet and open it and see the many different categories that each of the groups produced as qualitative results in terms of what they're using for technology under various conditions and for various purposes. We're hoping that that spreadsheet will prove very useful in the future. Yeah, the major themes that emerged from the qualitative results, were that there was a good deal of technology needed for training and professional development opportunities, and the use of technology for advising students and for assessment purposes as well. The qualitative analyses also showed a lot of detail, and of course we're not going to be able to go into that in 10 minutes, but just as an example, for the training aspect, which was a question addressed to the directors and to the instructors. For the flagship directors, we got 10 responses, and they responded with things like the fact that most of them indicated that they needed technology-related teacher training orientations and workshops, that attendance at conferences was one avenue for teacher training, that two respondents clearly found the item unclear. They didn't understand the question, and one response indicated the need for support, as you can see in the quote below that. So this is the kind of summary information that we provided for each of the qualitative questions in each of the groups as the report progresses. Yeah. It goes on and on. But in theme for future possibilities, main findings from the open-ended and qualitative responses were that there was a large degree of variation in the responses, but also there are indications that the language flagship is still exploring new options regarding technology. And basically, in terms of future possibilities, the major themes were that the use of technology is useful for enhancing teaching and learning of languages generally before, during, and after the flagship's capstone year. So there's a good deal of information separated out for before, during, and after the flagship. Moving on to the conclusions. In terms of technology use in the classroom, there's a wide variety of technologies, as I've indicated before. There were also similarities between the classroom-based technology uses and what students use regarding technology. However, a lack of innovation in classroom settings may be limiting how much students are aware of the technological resources that they have available for language learning. We also found information about trade-offs, that technology is difficult to access and implement for many instructors and directors in a way that is both efficient and able to keep up with the changing pace of technology. Innovation appears to require resources and training, of course, but the value is relative to the number of students, and its overall usefulness remains uncertain in certain programs. Students seem to be a valuable resource for both locating and learning about new technologies or new kinds of technologies, and the Excel spreadsheet indicates that in detail. Also, for standardization, one way to possibly account for the difficulties in implementing and learning about new technologies for language purposes is to develop shared platforms and tools for learning collaboratively across the programs, and that's a theme that came out a lot. Came out a lot in the qualitative data. While the practicality of this remains unexplored, the pooling of resources would seem to be one way to address some of the resistance and challenges for using more interactive and adaptive forms of technology. In terms of communication, collaboration and professional development activities seem to be numerous across the flagship programs. However, communication within programs for the individual stakeholder groups might be limiting the availability and buy-in of technology use in the classroom. All of the suggestions offered by the directors, the instructors, and students are listed and discussed in much more detail in the final report, and hopefully the comprehensive listing that we've provided in the Excel spreadsheet will serve as a valuable resource to everybody involved. Yeah. I want to stress that this was just an overview. I hope it's whetted your appetite a bit. If you go to the Technology Innovation Center website, you'll see this page where the LFTIC Flagship Survey handout is actually provided and available to you, as is the survey presentation that you've been looking at, and also the Flagship Survey full report in a PDF version, but also in a Word document version, which is the one I would encourage you to look at because it's got buttons that lead you to the surveys themselves and or the Excel spreadsheet. And so that's where I'll end this brief presentation with a heartfelt mahalo, which is the Hawaiian word for I live in Hawaii and you don't, haha.
All right. Thank you, JD. And that was the overview about the survey project. And of course, you can take a look at what we have on the website, which is the whole report is available there, and it has very interesting highlights. Moving forward with the strategic planning idea, one thing I wanted to talk to you about today was the way we're organizing this and how this all makes sense as a whole strategy. So one of the things that we're paying attention to is design thinking. If you're not familiar with that area, it's basically the idea of using the thought process of designers in order to come up with innovation or new ideas that can be usable. So the whole process is very human-centered, and it approaches the needs of technology and the needs for innovation, taking into consideration a couple of things. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more in a minute. But basically, a big idea in design thinking is that innovation happens in three different places. The project itself, which you can think of as, for example, all the symposia and all the input that we're receiving from you, from the flagship, and from other stakeholders. The issues and the solutions that are actually dealt with in all these symposia are part or one of the places where innovation occurs. The other one is more partnerships, and that's another aspect that we are actually paying attention to, and I'm going to refer to that in more depth in a minute. And then the innovation environment itself. So if you think about design thinking and how we fit in this construct, you can think of the symposia in the first year as fomenting ideas and issues that have to do with the project and identifying those partnerships that might be successful in creating some of the innovation that we're seeking. The innovation environment is what we think is going to happen after the first year, and that's going to be facilitated by the center. So you can think of the center in a way as an incubator for ideas that are very promising and that have some sort of potential to be made sustainable and viable. So if you think about design thinking, there are three main, let's say, criteria that you have to meet, and one of them is desirability. So the idea of identifying what is desirable in a certain context. The other idea is that what is identified should be economically viable. And the third criteria is that what is identified should be technologically feasible. Now, hitting the sweet spot here in the middle, identifying things that meet all these three criteria is actually difficult. It's very difficult, and that's one of the main constraints of technology, especially in education. The model lends itself to help us think about the processes that we need to implement and the ideas we need to consider in order to make things actually happen. So going into what is desirable, that's one of the criteria that design thinking upholds. Sorry, I missed the going into what is desirable. There is three things that the center is doing in this area. One, as you heard, the survey helps us identify some areas of technology that we need to pay attention to. One great product that is coming out of the survey is that spreadsheet list that JD mentioned, which contains a healthy list of applications and tools that are currently being used in the flagship. We hope that that's going to be an interesting baseline for future endeavors in the center. Another piece here is the NMC New Media Consortium strategic brief. I'm going to refer that towards the end of this presentation, but basically it's a collaboration with the New Media Consortium, one of the leading organizations in education and technology, that has shown interest in technology and language learning. Having the NMC as part of our collaborative efforts is a great thing because the NMC has international reputation and in instructional technology, instructional design areas, they're very well respected, and everything that comes out of the NMC has a seal of quality that we believe is important to have as part of the center. And finally, the symposia are the other space where we are identifying what is desirable. Now, as I said before, through the symposia, we're also trying to identify ideas and strategies that are both technologically feasible and viable. The idea of actually getting these three qualities of design thinking together in alignment is really hard. That's what we're experiencing in the symposia. And a little bit, I love doing remodels at home and doing projects like, remodeling the bathroom and things like that. And if you like that, there is a very well-known analogy of this pick tool that you can do when you do these projects. So the project can be good and cheap, but it's not going to be fast, or it can be good and fast, but it's not going to be cheap, or it can be fast and cheap, but it's not going to be good. And those constraints are similar to what we're experiencing in this process. When we identify things that are desirable and economically viable, then the technology is not there, or when we identify the technology and what is desirable, then they're not, the viability, economic viability is probably not there. And we know that a lot about in technology and education. There is a lot of things that we think are desirable and that are technology feasible and we create, but then it turns out that a single university, for example, creates a tool that is not economically viable, and then it needs a lot of maintenance and it needs a lot of funding to be sustainable, and that's something that universities don't do very well. So this doesn't mean that it's not possible to hit that sweet spot. We think that it's possible to actually find or identify certain ideas that might actually comply with these three requirements. So just to give you an example of how we're thinking about this, as I mentioned before, desirability is one of the things that we're thinking about in terms of technology and language learning. So identifying from the flagship what is desirable in terms of technology, and identifying from the profession at large what should be desirable, it's one important step. When you think about technology feasibility, the first thing you think about is probably infrastructure. And in terms of infrastructure, there are a lot of tools out there that do provide infrastructures that we could take advantage of that we're currently not using. For example, the Khan Academy or TED-Ed or Google Classroom, these are all huge infrastructures that are not really particularly interested in language learning, but the infrastructure is already there. So if there is a way for us to communicate our desire to create this a certain, or to foster a certain idea, these structures are already in place. So when you think about economic viability, there are two things that come to mind. One of them is funding. You need some sort of funding to grow ideas, and sustainability. Nobody wants to invest in an idea that is not sustainable. It's probably a bad idea. So we do have players in place already in the language learning and technology field who have figured out how to be sustainable and who do have some sort of infrastructure. For example, tools such as Yabla or Mango languages or Voxy are already there, and they have proven business models that are working. But in terms of desirability for us, maybe they're not quite there. So we also have, in terms of economically viability, we also have ways to receive funding or to seek funding. And for those, we have, for example, there's governmental agencies such as NSF, who, they were part of the first symposium of the Department of Education. And there's also foundations that provide some sort of assistance, and like, the Hewlett-Packard Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, and for example, the New Media Consortium just entered into an agreement with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and they have a huge project going on. So there are ways to make things economically viable from that perspective. So basically, what are we trying to do? We're trying to bring to the table all these stakeholders through the symposia, and we're trying to explore the possibilities of identifying those ideas that we think comply or meet all these three criteria, and see how we can actually add value to each of these criteria that we are very good in one area but not very good in the other. So it's in the foundation's best interest to have projects like ours, where we identify things that are desirable through a big convocation of a lot of stakeholders, and it's something that in a way becomes a win-win situation, because you want to put your funding in things that are clearly or have a lot of possibilities to succeed. And there's going to be time for questions if any of this is not clear. But in terms of the process, think of it in a linear way. That's what we try to show in this graphic. There is a series of symposia, as we said before, where we're trying to identify these ideas. And the first symposium started out with what is called in design thinking as divergent thinking. It's the idea that people think outside the box and create a lot of choices. So in this idea in design thinking is basically a core to the process. Then once you have all these choices and you have explored the landscape of possibilities in the area, you move on to a next process that is called convergent thinking, which is basically considering all those ideas and starting making choices. And that's what we're doing in Symposia 2 and 3. Symposium 1, we explore the landscape of possibilities. Symposia 2 and 3, we're going to start thinking about prototyping some of the ideas that are promising with stakeholders from those three sectors that I showed you before. So just to give you a little bit more information about the first symposium, which we think was very successful. The inaugural symposium focused on 4 lenses. And what we did was, as you can see there, the lenses are very technology focused. And we did that on purpose because we thought that technology is probably one of the common denominators among all the stakeholders. It's something that is easy for everybody to understand in a way. So we tried to think about 4 broad areas of needing technologies for language learning, and we tried to focus the discussions, somewhat focus of the discussions around those areas. So one area is adaptive technology, and for each of these areas, we had amazing experts working with us. If you don't know, Trudy Haift from Simon Fraser University is one of the leading experts in iCall. intelligent computer-assisted language learning, and she was the lead for this discussion at the first symposium. Then Steve Thorne, who is also very well known in pretty much all these areas, but he focused on learning on the go, basically mobile technologies and how mobile technologies can expand the possibilities that we have currently in terms of language education. Julie Sykes, who I'm sure you're familiar with because she's part of the Flagship family. Julie is, her expertise is in pragmatics, and she led the discussion called Breaking the Mark. And basically the idea there was to, how do you move, when you hit this plateau of proficiency, how do you move students up to the next level and reach levels 3 and 4 in the ILR scale. And finally, Scott Payne, who is a very old colleague who's been in the field for a long time, mostly in Calico, if you're familiar with that conference. Scott has done a lot of work. He was in Amherst for a long time, and he's done a lot of interesting work. And now he's one of the few people who had a very strong academic background and moved to business. He works at McGraw-Hill Education. So he's been there for a year. He has a very interesting perspective on how these things can be materialized in the business world. So now that we have an insider in both worlds, we thought we would take advantage of his knowledge. So Scott focused on frontiers in language technologies, and basically we dealt with two things there: big data and smart partnerships. And I'll give you a little bit more detail in a couple of minutes. So just to give you an idea, the symposium, the first symposium was very, very interactive. We had a facilitator, Nancy White, who is also well known, and she's been working with the European community in many projects that have, they're high stakes sort of projects. And she is joining us in the symposium, facilitating the conversation. So Nancy is also an amazing designer, and she can capture graphically the discussions. So if you go to our website, you can see these posters. These are basically a graphic capture of the discussions we had in the 4 lenses throughout the symposium. I'm going to show these in the slides, but all the information is already on the website for you to take a look at. And I'm just mentioning this because this was a very crucial part where people could actually see their ideas on paper. And after this process, there was a time during the symposium where people had the opportunity to put sticky notes and make corrections and make comments on these notes. We're using this as a starting point for the next 2 symposia, so that these ideas can inform, as well as the NMC report of the survey, what we're going to be doing next. So as I said, the symposium was very, very, very interactive, and we wanted, before I give you some of the highlights of the symposium, I would like to give the floor to Diana, who was one of the 5 Flagship directors present at the first symposium, and she can probably tell us a little bit about her perspective on how she saw this evolving. So Diana, we'll transfer on to you.
Hi, everyone. This is Diana Murphy from Madison, Wisconsin, from the Russian Flagship program there. And it feels like a dream being in Hawaii because I'm sitting in sub-zero Madison now. I promise that it'll be warmer in May when you all come visit for the annual meeting. My experience at the symposium it was like nothing I've ever participated in before. It was 2 full days of creative discussions around these 4 lenses that were presented to us all. So focusing, as Julio said, on adaptive technologies, on mobile technologies. We also talked quite a bit, at least in the conversations that I was part of, in immersive technologies and what some of the possibilities might be in that area, also about big data. I was left with following this symposium was a real sense of excitement at having the opportunity to talk with people, well, let me see. The symposium brought together colleagues not just from foreign language education and not just from the educational sector, but from private business, which was really fascinating to me to be able to talk with individuals who come at problem solving from a business perspective rather than from an academic or teacher's perspective. And also then colleagues who work in the field of human-computer interaction and other fields. It really helped me to think about things differently, to have that sort of range of different perspectives to draw on. But I left, frankly, from this first symposium feeling like it was and maybe this was intentional because it was this first design phase, it was a little bit of sort of a big soup. We had lots of different ideas, lots of different perspectives, and really amazing people involved in conversations. But my question, I guess, then is what happens next? And maybe that's what happens in Pittsburgh. But it was a really fantastic opportunity, and I'm really excited to see where this takes us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Diana. This is great. And yeah, actually, you're very right. This was a big soup in terms of, a mix of practical ideas and complex issues that arise through the conversation. And the idea now is to take those ideas and to start formalizing some prototypes based on what we have learned from the first symposium. Following up on what Diana just said, I would like to give you a very brief overview of what those ideas were, so that you have a sense of how things are being discussed. So in the first lens, which was adapting as we go, the focus, as I said before, was on adaptive technologies and how we can take advantage of those in the context of our flagship, of course, but also creating things that are, as we said before, economically viable and technologically feasible. So one idea that was repeated over and over was the need for coordinated efforts to collect data. And one of the computational linguists that was present there, as Diana said, mentioned, you guys have a goldmine of information here that we would love to have in computer science. For example, usage errors. If we can capture usage errors from students, those can be an amazing source of data for apps and for certain types of applications that you can create to support language learning. Another need in terms of collecting data was the idea that in order to make anything adaptive, you need to have corpora, and we need to have relevant language corpora. For example, we need to involve folks who have access to these corpora in the languages of the flagship, of course, and for example, corpora for Arabic, corpora for Swahili, so that the language corpora can help inform or can help serve as the engine for the adaptive tools that are built. There's also the need for meaningful metadata. Basically, the idea of metadata is, if you're familiar with language corpora, basically it's a collection, a corpus of language. And you can think of it, for example, all the Times magazine, for example, has a corpus, which is all the language, all the written pieces that went into Time magazine are accessible in one place. So that information is good. It gives you a lot of information in terms, for example, of syntax and things like that, but it's not very good if it's not annotated. And that's where it becomes very difficult, because annotating the corpus is a very time-consuming and it's a task that goes beyond what we could do in a program like the Flagship, but it could be of interest to someone who wants to turn this into a model that is sustainable. So we actually talked about those things quite a bit. Also the idea of having content that is annotated. For example, you have a certain sentence, and annotated with that sentence, you have the cultural relevance of the sentence, for example. Like if you say 5 o'clock tea, well, you know, if you think about British context, then what does that mean? It's not just 5 o'clock tea. There is a whole wealth of information that comes with that. But even if you have that, which we do have now in certain, for certain languages, we don't have what they call the pedagogical metadata wrappers, which is basically how to use that in an instructional context. So the problem is very complex, and it was great to have all this expertise from businesses and computer science folks and from the Flagship come together and talk about these things. Another need that emerged in this discussion was the need to identify learning pathways that can be useful for example, computer science folks to create relevant algorithms so that the adaptive tools can be useful for the context that we wanted to use them in. Another interesting idea that came out of this discussion was the need to involve Language Flagship alumni, since they have a lot of knowledge there that can be used in some of the development. And a recommendation was to start small and simple. In terms of mobile technologies, as I said before, one of the needs that emerged from this discussion was having a list or some sort of baseline of existing apps and tools that can be used. And the survey already has addressed that in part because we got feedback from students and from you and from instructors in the Flagship. And we know we have a long list of software there that we have identified that people are using already and that might be promising in our context. There's also the need for pedagogical adjustments whenever you try to integrate mobile technologies. You cannot just send students out and ask them to use mobile technologies. And there needs to be some sort of framework that makes sense to them. So one framework, pedagogical framework that makes sense is the idea of microtasks. That's basically tasks that are very short, accomplished very quickly, basically in less than 5 minutes, and that has some sort of takeaway for the learner. So creating repositories of these tasks, for example, would be one thing that would be very useful in terms of technology. Feedback beyond the classroom was another idea. And if you think about, for example, social media outlets that would allow students to get feedback from native speakers and tools in, that are related to that area. And another idea was, the idea of blended learning, for example, to send or outsource some of what is done in the language classroom outside that can be done very well with mobile technologies or any other type of technologies, such as apps or programs that do drill, for example. In terms of breaking the mark, the main focus of this lens was how do we take students to this higher level of proficiency? And one common denominator in the discussion was the importance of pragmatic ability. Basically, the idea of being able to function in the culture. And I always remember I had a friend who was a native speaker of Dutch in Argentina who was extremely fluent in Dutch. He had no accent. And I remember the first time he visited the Netherlands, he was shocked because he would ask questions such as, is this a mailbox? And people would look at him like saying, are you stupid? Because he sounded native. So just having the native speaker proficiency in the language is obviously not enough. So you need to know what a mailbox is in the environment where you are. And it doesn't look like a mailbox is in Argentina, but people thought this person must be stupid because he speaks without accent. He should know what a mailbox looks like here. It's a very trivial example, but it's an example of the type of pragmatic ability that needs to be developed beyond being a native speaker-like sort of in terms of proficiency. So to develop technologies that actually fit in this context, you have to have very ambitious types of technology, such as speech recognition, facial recognition, automatic response systems, automatic scoring, adaptivity engines, and feedback engines that give you context, give you feedback in context. So for these things to happen, it's clearly not an effort that we can take on our own. It needs to be something that people from these different areas can help us with or have an interest in developing things that will be useful at this level of proficiency. So in this discussion, there was also the idea of the need for partnerships to build things that are immersive and adaptive because of the complexity, technological and conceptual that you have in this kind of situations. And of course, one of the interesting and reminders here was not just the systems, but also think about developing the instructors who are using this. Sometimes the solutions are not as sophisticated as this, but they might be there, but if you don't have the appropriate teacher development that goes with it, then things don't work out as planned. So finally, the last panel addressed frontiers in language technology. And one of the main ideas that surfaced in this panel was the importance of APIs. And that's something that businesses brought to the table. APIs are application programming in little programs, let's say, that talk to each other, that make possible that web content communicates across different contexts. So think, for example, Amazon. Amazon has a huge store with a lot of items they have for sale. You can tap into the Amazon API and bring in that information to your website. So currently, that's very difficult to do in terms of products that are for language learning. So that was one of the issues that was brought up. And then, of course, again, the need for data, the need for learner language data to do, which is basically the basis for many of these, many tools that you can think of that are sophisticated. The idea of crowdsourcing was also brought up. The idea that, for example, you don't need to have a group of linguists trying to annotate a corpus. You can open this up like Wikipedia was opened up to the public, and then get information that gets curated and edited as people go through the content. And then one recommendation out of this panel was to focus on what data to collect and for what purpose, especially if we're thinking about flagship needs. So we talked a little bit about the survey, the symposia, how those were structured, and now I would like to refer a little bit about the Horizon New Media Consortium project. The New Media Consortium has been around for a while. It started out with collaborations similar to what we are doing in the symposia. Big players such as Apple Computers and Hewlett Packard and Microsoft, they were all part of this at the beginning. But then they wanted this to be sustainable, and it's become a nonprofit organization that is now collaborating across a great variety of sectors. So the New Media Consortium has gained some traction in the field by the Horizon reports. If you're not familiar with those, if you go to nmc.org, the Horizon reports are typically about higher education in general, and they have very interesting ways of presenting the information. The information is not presented in an academic form. It's not intended to be that way. It's intended to be more focused on the understanding of the common person of technology and education. So we thought the New Media Consortium was a great partner to have because of the credibility they bring to the process, and they have been collaborating with us. They were at the first symposium, and Samantha Becker, one of the executive directors, gave a presentation on how this New Media Consortium Horizon brief was shaped. So this will also be available soon. There is a draft of the brief that is currently being distributed to the editors. We have editors from many different places, including the four panelists that I referred to before. So they're editing the content and they're providing feedback. But basically, the brief is divided into three sections or three main areas. One, identifying trends and challenges that impact language education. And this is great because everything that is out there is basically, in terms of technology and education, tends to be STEM. So this is the first time the NMC focuses on language learning, and this is great news for us. Then the developments in technology for language education, and as you can see, the trends and the developments that they identified are aligned with the panels that we had in the symposium, and then recommendations in terms of what is available and where they think technology in language education will evolve. And moving forward, somebody asked a question there, okay, so what is going on in the second and third symposia? Well, second, as I mentioned before, the first symposium was divergent thinking. The second and third are going to be more convergent in the sense that we're going to end the symposium with concrete prototypes of ideas that the group thinks might be worth pursuing. As an overall goal, the goal of the center for the first year of operation is to have a very well-formed plan for how to allocate resources and efforts in the next 3 years. So these two next symposia are going to give us crucial information as to which areas we can explore partnerships, for example, with businesses or with academia that may result in projects that we can incubate and have the potential to become sustainable. So moving on, we have a Pittsburgh symposium coming up soon in 2 weeks, and then the last symposium, Next Steps, in San Francisco Bay Area in mid-March. We are also planning to involve more stakeholders and especially the Flagship community a little bit more in the annual meeting, and we have 3 events or 3 things planned for that. One of them is a technology showcase. Some of you probably have received some emails inquiring about projects. We're also using the survey to identify some promising projects there. And we would like to have some time and space for people who are interested in technology to take a look at what is possible, take a look at what is there, and to basically network and be able to come back to their institutions with some ideas, concrete ideas of what we can do. We also are working on a very small scale prototype for a simulation, and we don't have a lot of time to go into details with that. So, but we will give you more information about it in the annual meeting with some information about this worked out. We're piloting this with a couple of classes, so it's going to be an interesting project to think about as one of the things that the center could incubate and make possible through the Flagship. And finally, the NMC brief is going to be available, which we're going to share and maybe in a presentation or maybe during the technology showcase. So that's where we're going. And now we would like to open the floor for any questions or comments you may have. And as you can see there, there is a poll with some of the questions about this presentation. We'd like to get your feedback so that the next time we can improve on what we did today. And of course, there were technical glitches, which it always happens. It's just the way technology works. So again, we're very happy that you were able to. And we'll take questions if there are any questions in the chat. Sure, yes. So Madeline has a comment here, so I'm going to pass on the mic to Madeline.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to let you know that I am here representing Flagship. And what my role has been is more or less a liaison between the Flagship world and the design world that you have just had a glimpse of. I'm very excited to be part of this project, and also if you have any questions kind of for how this works, the things that you've heard about today might relate to specific efforts in Flagship, then I think we're free to take some questions now, have some discussion about that. I think the thing to remember is that this center is not really designed as a place to make decisions about specific projects that people might have that you would like to pursue, but rather to kind of get a broader picture about what kinds of things might be possible for all flagships, and especially down the line, say 5 years from now, what kinds of things would really work for our students then to enhance their experience of language learning.
So we have one question that I would like to address, and it's, is there any resource So what we are trying to help with is creating the strategy, especially this first year of operation. We're not jumping into creating what we think will be a cool app or a cool piece of software. There's a lot of ideas for cool things like that, but what is lacking is the thinking behind so that these things are sustainable and can have a life of their own rather than permanent funding behind them, which when we dries, the tools disappear. So this kind of technological decay is very common in our field, and we don't want to make that mistake. So for those of you that were expecting a resource, it's not quite the idea. The idea is to involve you in the discussion and to have ideas that we think can be instantiated through the partnerships with either funding or technology businesses that might be able to help in this area. There is also the potential of, as I said before, some of the tools that are already available that are not really probably meeting the needs of the flagship, to bring these people to the table. When doing that, we have 6 businesses coming to Pittsburgh in the next symposium and tell them, you know, this is something that is probably not working very well in our context. They will realize that when they see what we do. So there is a potential of some of these already big players to try to adjust their tools so that they actually work better. And in that case, it's a win-win situation because we don't have to have permanent lines of funding trying to grow things. And that's something that we don't do very well in academia. So I hope this answers that question. And there is a very interesting, and thank you for raising this up, the question of how can we contribute to learner data. So learner data seems is one of those gold mines that we have in the flagship that companies will be very pleased to have some sort of data so that they can actually customize the product. There is issues with FERPA, as you know, and issues of using learner data. So you have to be careful with that, and we are looking seriously into the possibility of trying to come up with a solution. There was actually a very interesting discussion in the 4th panel about this issue, and one of the things that companies are thinking about is to create synthetics, basically to create data samples that are not linked to any individual data, so you wouldn't be able to identify a person, or it's a very complex thing, but in any way, the idea is that we are thinking about those things, and we will be thinking hard about ways to get learner data and make that usable for our context. And once again, the poll is available. If you haven't done it already, feel free, please, to fill in the poll. There is an open-ended item there where you can include any questions or comments you might have. And I just been informed that the poll has been closed. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, we'll give you maybe a minute or two if you haven't figured out how to get to the questions, because I had some issues with that, if you look at the cursor on the screen, if you go up, there is a neon green bar. So you have to click on that bar to actually see the chat, and then you can submit the question.
This is a little bit like hosting a radio show.
All right. So we're standing by for just a minute or two. We don't want to miss anybody's feedback.
I think one of the things that we want everyone to know is that we're trying to make this a very inclusive project so that we can keep you informed of things every step of the way. Obviously, we can't include all the directors to every one of these symposia, so we want to make sure that there are lots of ways that you can access the information if you're not able to travel to one of these destinations.
All right, and as a reminder, we're going to record, this is recorded, this webinar was recorded, so we're going to make this available. So to share with colleagues that may not have had the opportunity to attend today. We are very much open for communication and feedback. So please feel free to use the email you see on screen and keep monitoring the website. The website is going to become more interactive as we continue developing it. For the time being, it's a very modest website that is simply uploading, we're uploading the information as much as possible as we are constructing it. And I don't think we have any more comments or questions coming in, so we're going to close here. And thanks again, everybody, for participating. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to continuing working with you. And
yeah, great. Great having a chance to talk to everybody, and looking forward to seeing everyone in May if we don't see you before then.